Okay, this is going to be a podcast. This is my first podcast. I don't know what to name the podcast. I think maybe I'll name it. The WordPress blog that I got, I named paxorexy.wordpress.com, and that's just where I'm putting it. It's just a place to put the podcast that people can go to and know it's there. I also have a Facebook and a Twitter, but it's on the WordPress is like where it is, and it's like syndicated out. It's syndicated, going big time. So I think I'll call it Paxorexy. The reason I chose the name Paxorexy, or for my WordPress blog, I don't know if that's what I'm going to call the podcast, but think about Pax Romania, Pax Americana, Pax Britannia, and the idea of those things were that, you had the British peace, the Roman peace, the American peace. And what I'm saying, like Sorexy, it's of insurrection. And insurrection is kind of violent in a sense, but it really means like to emerge from the bottom up. Right? And so Pax Sorexy could be interpreted as the emergent peace or the bottom up peace. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what I think I'll call this podcast. Pax Sorexy. Now, I'm playing Minecraft, and I'm sure a lot of people have thought about this. Minecraft is a very cartoony game. It's not realistic at all. But when playing it, I always think about what was life like in the far past. One, what was life like in the far past? And two, what was... Oh, it spawned right in a tree. Okay. What were minds like in the far past? I'd like to know what people thought back then. And what got me thinking about this is that in the game Minecraft, the bad guys, they all spawn at nighttime. I'm thinking, well, they spawn at nighttime. Well, why would why would this game crew, and why is it so, not just Minecraft, but so common to have like things that go bump in the day? No, things that go bump in the night. So what is it with this fear of the darkness? Well, it makes sense evolutionarily, because like out in the dark, humans are not nocturnal animals. They're daytime animals. And so being out in the dark, it limits our vision of things. We can't see things. Not only can we not see predators, but we can't see, say, a root jutting out from the side of a rock that could trip us and cause us to twist our ankle. There just lots of little things like that. Not necessarily that they're like really big predators that are nocturnal. I mean, I'm sure there are, but there's also just little trivial things that you twist. You're more likely to twist your ankle in the dark. I mean, of course, that's not trivial. In fact, twisting your ankle, I mean, that could be death. Like dislocating a kneecap back then, that could be the end of you. I mean, that could be it. You may not be able to get the proper food you need if you dislocate your knee. Yeah. So that makes sense evolutionarily, but I'm thinking more in another way, like your brain, like what you see in the world is so much a model. Like, and this is something that people don't appreciate, is just how much their view of the world, which seems to be like this solid, concrete, objective reality, how much of that is really just a construction. One example would be the stability of your view. Like take your head and like bob your head around a bunch. You bob your head around a bunch, yet the vision that you see of the world is roughly the same. If you turn your head to the side, the whole world doesn't seem to turn sideways, right? You still see the world right side up, but but what's happening is that your brain is taking the data and is doing some post-production before, quote-unquote, you see it. And what is this you? Well, that's another issue. So your brain is doing all sorts of things. And moreover, like, dart your eyes around the room, you know. You're not recording the entire room at all times. You're not like a camera that's recording something verbatim. What you're doing is you're taking snapshots. You're taking these little snapshots everywhere all the time. And from these little snapshots, you are creating, your brain then creates a model. It creates an image of the room based on a bunch of snapshots. And this is illustrated more thoroughly in an experiment I saw. I can't remember. I saw it in a documentary where these researchers, what they would do is they would take these little slips of paper and they would put these slips of paper in front of someone's eyes, right? And they would ask them to look at it, and then they would move the paper right to the periphery of the subject's eyes. And of course the subject would continue to see this little slip of paper right in the periphery of their vision. And they would keep it there for about 30 seconds in the subject's periphery. But then they would remove the piece of paper from the subject's periphery vision, and the subject would still see it. Right? And this is evidence that the brain is making stuff up, basically. And so they would remove it from the periphery, and then they would ask the subject to look at the paper, and they look and see it's not there, and they would be a little bit spooked. They'd be like, what? I saw it in my peripheral vision. No, it wasn't there. You know, it was there for 30 seconds, then it was removed, and your brain kept seeing it there. Your brain was making stuff up. So, and your brain makes stuff up all the time. And this is also seen if, for example, if you're just walking along, you know, in the middle of the day, and you're looking around, you know, you'll see something out in the corner of your eye, and you go, oh, there's nothing there. I was just seeing things. I'm seeing things. The phrase "I'm seeing things," right? Well, that's your brain just making stuff up. And in Minecraft, when do the monsters come out? Well, they come out at night. At night. When do you see the most things? At night, right? That's when you're out in the world at nighttime, you know, you can't see things very well, and so your brain lacks information. It lacks the information. It lacks the proper, you know, during the day when you can see things, your brain is taking a bunch of snapshots and is creating a coherent model of the world. And just how much it does is really quite extraordinary if you actually break it down, and that's kind of why babies have such a hard time with the world. Like all this stuff that we take for granted, say, why can't you see this? Like object constancy. Like, no, you put this rock here, then you put a little lid on the rock. I mean, the rock's still there. You know, for the baby, that's like something, whoa, the rock is still there. It doesn't disappear just because I don't see it. You know, we think that's silly, but I mean, that's not, I mean, we see that like it's self-evident that something exists, even though we can't see it. Like, that's something that's self-evident. But the truth is, it's not self-evident. Right? That's something you learned through experience. Objects being constant is not a self-evident truth. It's not an axiom. So yeah. And so at nighttime, you know, that when you're at night, your brain will create a lot of images. Now, maybe I'm like messed up, but when I was little, and it was like completely dark in my room, and I would open my eyes, I would see all sorts of things. I would see all sorts of crazy things. Now, I think that this is where the conception of a netherworld or a nether realm comes from. A realm that is somewhat transposed on the current world, but is not quite in the current world. You know? Because when you're in the dark, you'll see images, and you'll see, you know, you may see like skeletons dancing around, or or morbid faces popping up and stuff, and monsters, um, and stuff like that. And you may even see monsters in the trees, and that can be interpreted as like the nether realm, um, being visible through the current realm, like images in the tree leaves. Now, uh, when you try to interact with like the visions that you see, like we know because like these visions that we see in the dark, they don't make any sound. They're not entirely coherent. They're generally pretty fuzzy. And if we move our hand in front of them and like move our hand to like what we see the image, that image gets distorted or goes away entirely. And so if it is in fact a nether realm, weakly interacting with the world that we're in, that kind of makes sense. That is a that is a logical explanation for what we see, for all the images that we see in the dark. Now, with modern science, now we have an explanation for these images now. We understand more about how the brain works, so we can explain this. But there's nothing illogical about thinking that these things that they saw were, representative of something real, right? Because everything else they see is real. Like when they see a tree and they go over the tree and they touch it, I mean, it's real. Like what they see is like reality. They see reality. They didn't really think about like, well, the eyes are just a lens. And it's and what we see with our eyes is very different from what, say, a bee sees, right? So what we see is interpretive through a lens, the eye, and the brain itself does a bunch of post-production. And things that go bump in the night, right? It's not things that go bump in the day, it's things that go bump in the night. And scary stories typically involve some scary thing that comes out during the night. And you look at Lucifer, who is the prince of night. Or is he the prince of light? No, he's the prince of darkness. Hades, or hell in Greek, is it a bright place where people are tortured? No, it is a dark place where people are tortured. So that's and if people view like the images that they see in the dark as like the nether realm being imposed, and of course the images that they see in the dark tend to be sinister. They tend to be sinister looking. So, right, and so we have these sinister entities, right, which can be translated to demons, and demons which come out in the dark. And so that's where I think that the idea of demons came from, is images that people saw in the dark. Entities from another realm trying to break out into this realm, right? They're trying to break out into this realm. They can't quite break into this realm, but every once in a while they manage to do so, according to legend. Now, this trying to break in between realms, you may say, well, where does this come from? Well, have you ever been in a dream, and you know it's a dream, and you want to wake up, and you're trying to wake up, but you can't wake up? Like you're having a dream and it's really nasty and some bad thing, some maybe the archetypal black formless monster that doesn't look like any real animal. It's just like this black blob that's chasing you, and this is very, very common. And you want to wake up, it's like, wake up, wake up, wake up. Basically, you're trying to escape that realm. Now, back then, people didn't realize, well, sleep is just, your brain going into this state, and you're just and it's just creating images in your own head. You know, People back then, a proper assumption would be that no, when you dream, you are in fact traveling to another realm, right? You are, because why should they believe anything else? They don't know anything about the brain. And everything that they see in most of their conscious experience, when they see it, that means it's real. So if they see something in a dream, well, that must be real. Now, of course, a problem is they wake up from the dream, and it's not like they can take everything from that other realm into this realm. And in fact, their memories don't even transfer. Dreams. Like our dream memory is kind of weak because memory is state dependent, and when you're in a dream, you're in an extremely altered state, so the memories don't transfer properly. Yeah, an example of the state dependency of memory is like people who, for example, there's a study done where they took some kids and made them study drunk for a test. And if they studied drunk, they were better off taking the test while they were drunk. Now, of course, you're better off studying sober and taking the test sober, but if you study while drunk, you're better off taking the test drunk. You do better that way. You're better off not being sober for the test if you study drunk. That's an example. That's just an illustration of the state dependency of memory. So dreams, if you think of dreams as like not being we recognize dreams as just something that's going on in your own head. We don't, but if you don't know that it's just going on in your own head, if you think it's really happening, well, that's just, that right there, like a dream, is prima facie evidence of other realms, right? It's to you, like it's real. I experienced it. I traveled to this other realm, this mystic realm, where there's all sorts of crazy things going on, where with like incredible heights, like they had buildings that went up, 10,000, like dream height, and where the intensity of emotions were far greater than that in this realm, right, and so that creates and so if you think about just how heady dreams are, that creates a very, very powerful seed for religion. And so what I think is that people in the past, like religion today is like kind of this abstract thing. Like you make arguments for God. Well, I believe God, and moreover, a lot of people believe God because it gives them a sense of purpose, and tells us about an afterlife and all this stuff, right? I don't think that that's what religion was at the beginning. I think religion at the beginning was much more visceral, was much more real. Like there wasn't this, there wasn't such a thing as like we have like these Sunday Christians. For them, it wasn't like that. It was like they knew of God not because of like something they read in the Bible or some experience they had while singing, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, let my people go. No, they had a direct experience talking to entities from another realm. Also, they could have had a waking dream, like a schizophrenic episode. And I believe people in the past had more schizophrenic episode. And one reason of that is because of evidence compiled by an author named Julian Jaynes in his book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And in it, he shows a bunch of pieces of evidence of basically the creation of the subjective sense of I, the creation of I. He was talking about people who did not have who could not self-reflect. That is, they viewed, like if you looked at early Greek literature, they would talk about, they would say something like for example, like when we talk about like our heart racing in response to a circumstance, we would say, my heart raced, I was terrified and all this stuff. Whereas in early Greek literature, they would say things like, the phrenes, uh, uh, like, you know, like my thumo, they would say the thumos rose, or they would say something the equivalent of the heart beat fast, or the lungs breathed heavily, right? They wouldn't say my lungs breathed heavily. No, they would say the lungs breathed heavily. And it was later on that you saw a transition of from that kind of writing, that kind of like writing without the use of I, um, to more of a writing that involved the subjective I. And more, and he also talks about old epics that were rewritten in Greeks. Remember, Greece was around for a long time, so they had, like, for example, the Iliad and the Odyssey written by Homer, but then it was, or supposedly, but then it was rewritten, and it was written a bunch of different times by a bunch of different writers, and it was all said to be by Homer. But I mean, it was rewritten. And there are different editions and stuff, and he traces the change in writing style from the different editions, away from this kind of descriptive, the heart beat, the lungs breathe and stuff, to more, my heartbeat, or I started breathing heavily, towards the I. And he documents this transition, and it wasn't an overnight thing. Like you saw, and you saw stuff like that. Another thing, that's another thing. Like people in ancient times could do a lot of crazy things. For example, like the Trojan War, which was, according to legend, it was a war fought over a girl, I think, and it was fought, and it was fought over a girl, and there were some petty feuds between two kings or whatever. It was something that we look at that today and go, wow, they're crazy. All these people died over their little love tryst or whatever. But back then, they were never taught that was an absurd thing to do. Like, I mean, we look at that and we say, that's absurd. Well, they were never, why? I mean, it's not objectively a wrong thing to find. I mean, the Izot gap, that's something that a lot of people should realize, that there is no objective ought. There is no objective truth or objective way things should be, or anything like that. It's all subjective. It's all social. So, yeah. And people in the past had smaller brains. We can be fairly sure of this. I don't know if there have been anthropologists actually going around measuring the brains of people in the past, but I think there have, and I think they have shown that people in the past did have smaller brains. But I do know that as recently as 1910, East Asian people, as measured by Samuel Jordan, East Asian people had smaller brains than Europeans. Today, of course, East Asians on average have larger brains. But 1910, this was before industrialization. Even in Japan, while they had industrialization, and Japan was industrializing, it was still lagging, It was still, like you'd have the generation that at the time that industrialization started, and industrialization includes industrial agriculture, which leads to the proper nutrition, which leads to proper brain development. Even as Japan was industrializing, you still had this generation that had lived in a malnourished pre-industrial state. So, while industrialization may have been going on in Japan for 20 years, that's still only one generation. That's still one generation of industrial men. Basically everyone over 20, had lived most of their life well, not everyone. I guess everyone over 40 had lived most of their lives pre-industrial style, and so they were of shorter stature. The average height of Chinese, I think, went from about 5 feet at the turn of the century to about 5'6" today. And that, of course, comes from the proper nutrition, and their brain size has gotten larger. In the past, East Asians had smaller brains than Europeans. Now they have larger brains than Europeans from getting the proper nutrition. But of course, East Asians at around the turn of the century, at around 1900, while they were quote unquote malnourished by modern standards, they were plenty nourished. They were not malnourished by, say, ancient Roman standards or by medieval Europe standards. In fact, by medieval Europe standards, they were probably fairly well off. And so these people in the past, they had smaller brains. Their brains were not as developed as ours simply because they lacked the proper nutrients, mainly saturated fat, required to develop a proper brain, or to develop their brain fully. Now, you will still see, even though, here's the thing, even though nutrition plays a role in brain development, you will still see genetic differences or genetically predetermined differences between people. Because think of it like this. When your body gets 10 nutrients, your body is genetically programmed how it's going to spend those nutrients, right? So it could say, well, I got 10 grams of protein. Based on my body's blueprint, 3 of them are going to go to the legs, 3 of them are going to go to the arms, 2 of them are going to go to the back, or whatever, right? Where someone else, it could be, well, 4 of them are going to go to the legs, and only 2 of them are going to go to the arms. So there's a different usage of protein based on your genetic code. Now, for East Asians have, not only do they have larger brains in absolute terms, but much larger in relative terms because their overall body size is smaller, larger brains. And so we can look at their body blueprint, and that for any given amount of nutrient, more of that is going to go to the brain than, as a percentage, than it is for Europeans. So for any given nutrition level, East Asians are going to have bigger brains, right? Because that's how their blueprint is. Like if they get 10 grams of protein and a European Caucasian gets 10 grams of protein, on average, right? These are average racial differences. The European Caucasian is going to have a smaller brain. Now, today, where basically people don't get hungry, or people in Japan or Korea or Taiwan, and about half of China today don't get hungry, they have all the nutrients that their blueprint can master, can deal with. And so they're basically maxed out, quote unquote, in terms of nutrition for brain development. Like we're maxed out in terms of as much as nutritional improvements can do, as far as we know. And of course, at this maxed out level, then you can basically see the difference between Europeans and East Asians at this maxed out level. But of course, in the far past, we were far from being maxed out. Right? People were far from being maxed out in terms of the nutrition of their and their brain development. So they had, not only did they have physically smaller brains, but we could say they had much smaller minds. Now, just a simple thing, because I know a lot of people say, well, does brain size, does that really matter? Because, I mean, Einstein had a small brain. And that's true, Einstein did have a small brain. All else being equal, yes, brain size does matter. Given an identical structure, bigger brains do tend to be smarter. Now, of course, all else is not equal. Whales, dolphins, and elephants have much larger brains than humans, but of course, we would say that humans are much smarter than whales, dolphins, and elephants. Although, on the other hand, whales, dolphins, and elephants are some of the smartest animals on the planet, and we would say that a Doberman is much smarter than, say, a rabbit or a squirrel. Right? And so, brain size does seem to play a role. There does seem to be a correlation between intelligence and brain size across all species. And there is one a correlation between intelligence as proxied by standardized tests, by IQ tests, and brain size. It's about 0.38 for males and about 0.41 for females. And of course, the correlation is not 1. If brain size was the only thing that mattered, then the correlation would be 1. But of course, there's things, the structure of the brain is more important, right? Which is why the correlation between brain size and IQ is not 1. And of course, there's also the problems with the IQ tests. I mean, IQ tests are not perfect. Their IQ tests are a rather rough measure of you know. I would say that they are a rough measure of intelligence. These psychometricians, they try to do the best they can to measure like what they call the general intelligence factor, but there's only so much you can do. But anyway, the point being that brains were smaller back then, and of course because these populations were roughly the same as us genetically, there's not enough time to evolve genetically. We could say that the average brain structure of ancient man was roughly the same. It's just that the brain was smaller, and their body was smaller. Right? And if you look at medieval archways and doorways, people today will look at them and go, "Wow, these are really small entryways." Well, they were perfect. They were just fine for people back then because people back then were a lot smaller. So, and they had smaller brains, and they probably had smaller minds. And my perception is that they had more skizzy minds. That is, they had minds that were more prone to hallucination. Hold on, I could go 32 minutes. And that they were more prone to hallucination. And not only were they more prone to hallucination, they were prone to hallucination because they had a lot of deficiencies. And when you have deficiencies, you have funny images. You screw up a little bit. Like, yeah, you're more likely to enter altered states when you're starving. And when you're in a state of not what you would say full-blown starving, but kind of hungry, and you're constantly kind of hungry, you're more likely to see things out of the corner of your eye, right? Which is and of course, really seeing things out of the corner of your eye, that's just like a mini schizophrenic episode. A full-blown schizophrenic episode is when you see something that you know is not real right in front of your face in broad daylight. Now, of course, you could see something right in front of your face that you know is not there when the lights are out. And, that's also kind of a schizophrenic episode as well. And so basically, just a full-on schizophrenic episode, that's just a more extreme thing of what we already see. Like, you do see things. You have seen things out of the corner of your eyes. You have seen things in the dark that you know are not there. So a full-on schizophrenic episode is just like a really, really more vivid version of that. Sometimes schizophrenic episodes can also have auditory to accompany the visual. Now, I'm lucky. I've never had a visual plus audio schizophrenic episode. I have had... See, the thing is, I have problems with waking up. That is out like when you're asleep, your body is paralyzed a little bit, and that's of course to prevent you from hurting yourself while you're dreaming. But my problem is that sometimes I will wake up sort of, and my eyes will open, and so my eyes are open, and so I'm seeing the room that I'm in, and I'm sleeping. But I can't move my body. And when this first happened to me, I was terrified. But now it happens so often that I'm just like, oh God, okay. Try to move your hands. Try to breathe. Try to hyperventilate. Like, that's what I try to do to wake myself up is hyperventilate. Because for some reason I can still control my lungs. and I can still, I mean, and I know like the idea is that I shouldn't be able to control my lungs because my lungs are basically in involuntary mode, but I can still, and yeah. Now, when I'm sleeping around people and I'm having this and I'm trying to wake myself up, like I'll hyperventilate, and a lot of people think, they'll say, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And they'll say, "What was wrong? You were hyperventilating. Were you scared?" And I wasn't scared. It's just I was trying to wake myself up. Now, of course, the heavy breathing, like that's associated with fear. But I'm not scared when I'm doing that. I'm just trying to wake myself up. I'm trying to, or I'll try to move my hands, and if I can move my hands a little bit, I can try to, and so if I move my hands, then that I can start to move my arms a little bit, and I can start to finally wake up. But the thing is, when I'm in that state where my body is still paralyzed but my eyes are open and I'm perceiving the room, I'm not quite awake. I'm still in a quasi-dream state. So even though I see the room around me, the other parts of my brain are still asleep, and they're still creating dream imagery, right? And so you can see where this is leading. So they're still creating dream imagery, and so while I'm in that quasi-awake state, I can see things. And I had one example recently where I had opened my eyes and I could see the room around me, but of course I was paralyzed and I was still kind of in a dreamy state of mind. And I was, hyperventilating, trying to move my hands, trying to wake myself up. And then I looked in front of me and I saw this pink face, this fat pink face, right? And it was bouncing and it was coming toward me. And I was kind of spooked, And I knew what it was. I knew I was hallucinating it, and I knew it was a result of my in-between states. But it was this thing. It was coming at me, bopping back and forth. Right? It wasn't making any sound. Thank goodness. If it was an auditory hallucination in addition to this visual hallucination, I would be scared out of my mind. But it, I saw what it was. I knew what it was, but it was in like broad daylight. Right? It wasn't like the darkness imagery. It was in broad daylight, and it was bouncing toward me, and so it was getting really close toward me, and I eventually got so scared that I actually woke up. But it was weird because my waking up in that situation, I didn't open my eyes and find myself in a room that I was sleeping in. No, by waking up, the image disappeared. That was my version of waking up. I was already in the room, so I already perceived the room, right? And so all waking up constituted was me gaining control of my body. I could move my arms around, and that imagery disappeared. That's all waking up entailed. And so it was really weird. So it was basically like in a dream, there's a more of a split between what happened in the dream and then what happened in reality. Like you can, even if you remember something really horrible happening in a dream, you don't remember it very well because memory is state dependent. But even if you can remember it, there's kind of a division there, right? It's like it's another realm, right? The nether realm. But for me, when you have a schizophrenic episode and you wake up from the schizophrenic episode, quote unquote, there's not that split. It's like you saw something and then that thing just disappeared. It's not quite like a split. Like for example, I have the memory of that pink bouncing thing coming toward me, and I also have memories from dreams, but that's different. It's a different kind of memory. Like the memory of the pink thing coming toward me, it's basically like a real memory to me, as far as I'm concerned. Like I remember it as something that really happened. Now consciously, I know that it didn't happen. I know what it was. But perceptually, it's no different. It's no different than remembering talking to a guy down the street. It's very real. But of course, and in the past, when they didn't know about the brain, they thought that these things were gods, or demons, or whatever, or something from the nether realm. Now, when people have hallucinations today, that the direction of their hallucination and the interpretation that they make of the hallucination, both while they're hallucinating and after the fact, is culturally influenced. Like, for example, if you're in ancient Greece and you have hallucinations, you're going to interpret your hallucinations, and of course you're interpreting while you're hallucinating, and that of course influences the hallucination. You're going to interpret it as the Greek pantheon. If you're Egyptian, you're going to interpret your hallucinations as the Egyptian pantheon. If you're a Christian, you're going to interpret your hallucinations as being angels and demons. If you're an atheist, you might interpret your hallucinations as being an alien, right? So you're gonna imagine that aliens had abducted you. And now in Christianity, there are angels and demons. If your hallucination is of a benign presence, then it'll be an angel. If your hallucination is of a malignant presence, it's going to be a demon. Now with alien abductions, you have people who say that the aliens who abducted them or visited them were nice, or that the aliens who visited them were hostile. And so you have kind of this debate: are aliens hostile or are they nice? And this is basically a result of hallucinations, whether or not the hallucination is of a evil presence or a comforting presence. Now, for those of you who have not had schizophrenic episodes, if you're schizophrenic, do not do this. Do not do this. This may trigger a schizophrenic episode. But to people who have never had any kind of schizophrenic episode, what you can do is you can kind of create a sensed presence. Find a window that you like with the blinds closed, or a door that's closed, and just imagine that there's somebody on the other side of that door. All right, just imagine that there's somebody there. All right, really think about that. Really think that there's somebody there. All right. So you can sense a presence on the other side. Now, some people can create the feeling of another person on the other side more strongly than others. But it's obviously that's the kind of thing that schizophrenics have when they sense when they have a schizophrenic episode of another person in the room with them, right? Now, what you did when you kind of imagine another person on the other side of the door, you do have a little bit of a sense presence. You can invoke a sense presence voluntarily inside of you. It's not very strong though. You know that there's nobody on the other side of the door. You know that if you open the door, it's just going to be an empty. There's not going to be anyone there. You know that. That when you open the door, it's just going to be whatever architecture is there. But if someone has a schizophrenic episode, the feeling is so strong. It's basically that feeling, but to a much higher degree. Yeah. Same with if you've ever quote unquote heard things, right? We know saw things or seeing things out of the corner of your eye, right? That's basically low level schizophrenia. Hearing things, that's really just very, very weak schizophrenia. For example, I had a situation where I was on a field trip in. I was in kindergarten, and we were on a field trip, and I was in Colorado, and we were up in the mountains, and we were playing through rocks, and we were finding quartz and stuff. So we were on a field trip, and I was kind of went off in my own direction. And I was looking through rocks, and I forget what I was doing. I was goofing around with some bugs, playing with ants, and collecting some rocks I thought were neat. And just out of nowhere, I heard from this booming voice saying, "Go back." And that's it. It said, "Go back," really loud. But what was weird is it was just the audio, "Go back," but I also knew what it meant. I knew that it meant go back to the van where there were, that the field trip was on. Like go back to where the kids were being loaded and stuff. Basically, go back to the group. So I knew that it meant, and that's another thing with dreams. Like, there's instantiated dream knowledge. That, it's not that you inferred something. Like you can see something in a dream. Like you can see like a mushroom, and when you have the dream, you know that what the mushroom means. You know that the mushroom has some symbolic meaning. Now, it's not that you looked around the dream and inferred some clues and stuff to determine the meaning of the mushroom. No, you had instantiated dream knowledge that you knew what that meant. Similarly, I had instantiated knowledge that I knew what go back meant. Anyway, I went back, and there were 3 vans that were taking us up to like this little mountain place, and 2 of them had already left. One of them was the van that I was supposed to go in, and they had checked my name off by accident, even though I hadn't been taken in. Now imagine, I was like a kindergartner up in the mountains, like with no one. I mean that'd be pretty scary. That could have been a pretty scary situation. And my subconscious mind was keeping track of these things. While I was playing with ants and collecting rocks and all this stuff, my subconscious mind was watching what was going on and thinking, uh-oh, this is not good. Time's a-ticking. We should get back. So yeah. Now, well, in ancient times, people would say, well, that was your fairy godfather or some guardian angel looking out for you doing that stuff, right? But no, it was just your subconscious mind looking out for you. Anyway, religion and the state. Today we have this very modern notion of the separation of church and state, and it really is a rather modern notion. Because think of it this way, if God knows best, because the subconscious mind does know better. The subconscious mind is not omnipotent, right? For example, the subconscious mind, you could like commune with mind, and your subconscious mind could give you advice, and that advice could be wrong, right? Because it's just brain, right? It's just brain tissue doing the best it can to make sense of the world. So it can be wrong just in the same way that the brain tissue that constitutes the conscious mind can be wrong. And we recognize that. But the thing is, if you think that the ideas are coming from the God, then you're less likely to think that it can be wrong. Right? And so, if you think that like what you have are ideas that are coming from gods, and that God knows the best, then why not force people to do what God wants? Right? That we have this modern notion that that other people don't know, like we recognize what a state is. Like we recognize that a state is people telling other people what to do. That is, people in government don't have any special powers. They're not more disciplined than average people. They're just like regular people like you and me. They're not on a higher plane or anything like that. But if you think that the state is informed by God himself, and yes, himself, then you're not going to have that kind of a relativistic view. You're going to see, well, this is God's commandments. This is what God wants. This is God's will. God, the Creator, wants you to do this. And in that way, that's where you get the first states. And I know a lot of people who have lived in states their entire life, like really can't have a hard time getting their minds around this. But law predates the state, right? Judges came before kings. What would happen is that 2 people would have a dispute in regards to land, in regards to water rights or something, and in order to mediate the dispute, they would both agree on a mediator or a judge, and so they would both agree to abide by whichever way the judge ruled. Now, the kinds of people who became judges were people who were known to produce fair rulings. They were fair-minded people. And so judges were very respected. Their authority was earned by making reasonable judgments and equitable judgments on disputes. So you had law that predated the state. And so what would happen is that by these rulings that these judges made over time would build up. And this would form a corpus of law, which is known as, or common law. That is law that is developed through dispute resolution. And this is separate from law that is imposed from the top down, from a king. King's law, royal law, Pharaoh's law, or whatever. So common law predates the state, and moreover, in early states, when you say you have a bunch of people, and a bunch of people that they had irrigation. Irrigation also predates states. So you had people getting together. They had laws set up. They had irrigation set up. They had mining set up. They had writing, which developed first as a form of record keeping for long distance trade. They had writing. Okay, they had defensive schemes. They didn't have the kinds of armies that states have, because they couldn't mass people. They couldn't conscript thousands of people into an army over vast territories, right? They were for these small bands, right? But they had defense. They had these things. Now you're telling them, you're going to go up to these people and you're going to tell them that they should submit to the will of this guy who is going to tax them, and then he is going to decide how these taxes are spent. He is going to take whatever, 10% of your grain, and then he's going to use them in a way that benefits you somehow, in a way that you don't know. He has better wisdom than you. He is wiser than you. And he's going to use this in a way to better you and your tribe and your clan or whatever. Right? I mean that would be absurd. They would laugh at you. That is a joke. Now, if, on the other hand, you argue that this man is determined, it's enforcing the will of God, that is, you need to give this man the money because either he's a priest or he is a king who is sanctified by the priests, or he is some way, the will of God is being manifested through him. Right? If you have these things, then that's a better argument to these people. The idea that a state can do things for them that they cannot do for themselves, that's just retarded. It's retarded to them apparently, but I would also say that it is in fact retarded even today. But that's not the point of this podcast here. My anti-statism, but. So that's why you saw in all these early kings, right? They were all, like, for example, the Sumerian city-states, they all had a demigod. The early Egyptian city-states, before Egypt was unified, they all had their own gods. You had the gods of Abu Simbel. You had different gods of Memphis, and each city would have their patron deities, and some patron deities would have multiple cities, things like that. For example, in Sumer, you had the Sumerian kings list, and the kings list, it was said to be, that is, the people who were kings was on a list, and it was who was king descended from heaven. Like, this list descended from heaven, and which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because there were new kings that were becoming kings going forward. So how would, I guess, a new name was added to the list, but this name came from heaven or something, I don't know. But basically, the kings were justified by the gods. One of the most well-known examples of this is Hammurabi. In Hammurabi's code, Hammurabi's code comes ostensibly from Hammurabi communing with the sun god. So he communes with the sun god, and the sun god says, here's what you should do. And that became Hammurabi's code. It wasn't Hammurabi himself who came up with the code. It was the sun god who came up with the code. Also, Hammurabi's code was kind of ridiculous. Like it set like fixed prices for grain. Like each, like a cow was worth X many bushels of grain. So of course it didn't. So of course, if you had a situation where the grain crop was poor one year, but the cattle crop was booming, it wouldn't matter, right? Because there was a fixed exchange rate, and so that would cause a lot of trouble. Like you couldn't fluctuate prices of things based on the flow of production, because there's fixed and set prices according to Hammurabi's code. Yeah, yeah. Hammurabi. So that's really where the state comes from. It comes from religion, and this has been further documented in a book, $100 book, which I didn't read, but I read the Google Books preview of, Ideology and Early State Formation. It's by Henry Clausen. And in it, he goes over the Mayans, he goes over the Indus Valley, Sumer, goes over Egypt, he goes over China. And in it, he talks about how states require ideology. And in early states, that ideology was religion. And it was through control of religion that these states formed. And with a religion, and if you recognize that states come from religions, then you already see within religion, like, the embryo of modern states. Because, like, what do you have in a religion? Well, you have tithing. You have people paying money to the church or to the priest or whatever. So they tithe, right? So that's like a tax right there. Okay, but all you have to do is go one step further and say that, and go from voluntary tithing to involuntary tithing. And we can speculate as to how this step was made, but it wouldn't be that hard. Like let's say you have a priest that convinced 90% of the people in the town to tithe, 10% aren't tithing. Then the priest could say, well, it is immoral and it is a sin against God to not tithe, and so people who don't tithe should be sent to the stockade and given 80 lashes, right? So once they do that, they basically become a state. So, because if you don't tithe, aka pay your taxes to the church, aka the state, then the state is, aka the church, is going to punish you somehow. What do states do today? Well, what they do is they throw you in a cage where you'll probably get bummed. Or if you resist being thrown into the cage, when the police come to your house to try to haul you off, they do say, no, get away from me, and defend yourself like you would against any home invader. They'll kill you. And of course, no doubt, the ancient religions would do that. If you resisted your 80 lashes violently, they would kill you. So we see a plausible mechanism for early states forming in this way. We see the parallel between the enforcement mechanisms of modern states and archaic states. And we see that early states were all justified by religion. The kings were always either demigods or justified by gods or enforcing the will of God. And religion itself comes basically from hallucinations and trying to make sense of the world without science in a pre-scientific way. So that's really how I see states, and that's why I explore. I'm really interested in schizophrenia, and so I read a little bit about schizophrenia, and I'm really interested in the psychology of ancient man, because that is the psychology in which states formed. And if you really think about states today, they're really kind of nutters. You know, imagine if like, for example, Walmart did this. Imagine if Walmart claimed vast swathes of unimproved land, and then said, if you want to live in this area that we don't touch, but we just claim by fiat, I claim the moon, I claim all the, like, they just claim this land. They're not using it, they just claim it. If you want to live here, you have to do what they say, pay the taxes they say, and if you don't do what they say and pay the taxes they say, then they're going to throw you in a cage or shoot you. Right? If Walmart was doing something like this, there would be lots of protests. But of course, when the state does it, oh, well, it's not insane or psychotic. It becomes a somber service that is crucial to civilization itself. Right? And of course, when you look at the United States, for example, what do you see? You see lots of temples. You see big statues of Lincoln, statues of George Washington. You see the faces carved on the sides of mountains, right? Like the pharaohs, right? Like those cataracts where you had the first and second cataracts or whatever. You had the pharaohs carved in the side of the mountains, right? You have the giant obelisk. You have the imposing columns on all the architecture. You have the Statue of Liberty. Now, I will go a little bit further. That is, I think that people in ancient times, when they stared at a statue for a long period of time, they would actually see the statue start to talk. That is, they would actually hallucinate the statue's lips moving. And I know that that is something that most people are going to say is crazy. I thought it was crazy when Julian Jaynes first proposed it, but he provided some evidence that it makes sense. For example, like the saying that statue talks to me, or that painting, it really speaks to me. Like, we mean it kind of metaphorically now. Now it's just a metaphor. But what if, at one point in time, it was not a metaphor? That it has become a metaphor as brains developed, as we have the proper nutrition to develop our brains. But what if before that, it wasn't metaphorical? That they really meant that when I stare at the statue say if I stare at the statue for like 30 minutes, and if you stare at something for 30 minutes, it's possible that you can start hallucinating things. I know, for example, miners, when they go down into a mine that is pitch black, that it takes about, and it's pitch black and like completely silent, it takes about 20 minutes for them to start hearing voices. And these are normal people. These are not schizophrenics or whatever. These are just normal miners going down into a mine that's pitch black, and if they go down alone, they'll start hearing voices. And it freaks them out. And they're not schizos. Like, when they go out, they're totally functional in real life and stuff like that. So, to think that ancient people, if they stared at a statue for a long period of time, for example, why don't you like stare at a picture of someone, or open up a Google browser, or your browser, Google browser, I'm putting Google before everything. I'm being assimilated by the Google Borg. Just have like an image of a statue. Let me do this. And like look at the statue, and just imagine the statue. Imagine the person about to talk. Just imagine that the statue is imagine that the statue is animate. That it is about to talk, and that it can talk. And just really look at it and perceive it as being about to talk. Maybe you can even have some, like, in the back of your mind, images forming of the statue looking at you and starting to talk. Right? That as you stare at the statue, you can perhaps imagine the statue turning its head toward you, if it's not facing at you right now. I don't know what statue you're looking at. But like turning its head at you, and its eyes stared at you, and then talking to you. You can imagine that. And you can even sort of see it happening. Like, and of course, and this is another preconception. Like, we don't see one thing. We don't see just one thing. when we're looking at the world. Like for example, a computer monitor, for example, can only display one image. Like it can display a picture in picture, but even that's just pixels on the same screen, right? It can only display one true image. Our brains are actually seeing multiple things at the same time. So while we're looking at the statue, we can both see the statue in reality being static, but at the same time, in the back of our minds, see the statue turn toward us and like talk and stuff. Now, in a dream, for example, I've noticed this, and I'm sure hopefully you can relate, is that in a dream, when I look at something and I imagine that this something is about to become animate, like I look at like a statue in a dream, and if I stare at it, the statue will in like 2 seconds become animate and look at me and start talking to me in a dream. And that happens. It's very quick in the dream. Of course, when you're in a dream, you're basically in that state. What I'm saying is that people in ancient times, they're not quite in a dreamlike state in waking reality. I mean, they can't do otherwise. They couldn't survive. I mean, they'd be just kind of wandering around and like, shitting themselves. They'd be like a person who's high on drugs. Kind of like, wandering around and doing things that are extremely destructive, but they don't know they're destructive. And yeah, and you've seen little cartoons of that. So you know what I'm talking about. But it's not hard to imagine that ancient people, while not in what we would call a dreamlike state during their lives, were more towards that than we are today. And so that if they looked at a statue for 30 minutes, that statue could start to speak to them, literally. That they could see the statue speaking. And it would be like they would look at it and it would start speaking, and then if they lose their focus, that it would stop speaking, and then they would have to like refocus their attention to see it speaking again. You know, and I think people know what I mean when I say that. Whereas us today, we could stare at the statue for an hour and try to imagine it speaking, and it won't speak to us. We will not see the lips move. We will not have an auditory hallucination. Like probably 95% of people would not. And the reason I think that is, and this is just speculation, is I think that's because people today have enough saturated fat for their brain to develop properly. And the brain is really dependent on fat, and that's of course why people on low-fat diets tend to get depressed. People who go on the Pritikin diet get depressed because their brain's starved. Yeah. So I think all that's pretty interesting. I think that's where states come from. So like the real origin of the state is really this kind of dreamlike. I keep saying dreamlike over and over again, and I'm overusing the word, but really that's really the best word I can think of for the kind of mentality, and that's where states come from. And when you really think about what a state is, it is kind of nuts. It is kind of nutters. So, and it makes sense that it would come from a nutter's state of mind. It would come from religion, and religion, which is of course a product of dreams. So if you want to get at the real root of support for the state comes from, well, I mean, today it's just inertia, right? Today people, they've lived their entire lives under a state. The state has the monopoly on law. They have no idea. Like polycentric law, they look at that, they go, oh, it would just be chaos. The world will spin off of its axis. It is the state. Right? It is the hand of God. No, it is the hand of the state that keeps everything steady and ordered and all this stuff. And it's not that people like people today, like if someone came up to people today and say, hey, you should support a state because the will of God, blah blah blah, they would laugh you out. People are more sophisticated than that. They would not fall for that today. But because they have lived under a state, they don't know anything different. Right. And that is why we have states today. But it is important to recognize the historical roots of the state being religious, even if modern states are not justified today in the same way. I think modern states today are just justified mainly through fear of anarchy. Anarchy. Now, it's not now that's not the same as socialism. The root for socialism is not the same. That is not the same as the root for the state. And in fact, and this is going to kind of predates it, going to get into another podcast. Early socialism was mostly anarchistic. And because like the state comes from religion, socialism comes from the tribe and the community, and the tribe and the community that's all pre-state. So the innate desire for socialism, which then gets transmuted into macro political forms, that's not necessarily statist. So socialism is not necessarily statist. It doesn't have the same origins, and early socialist movements were not statist because I don't want to get into that here. That'll be the subject for another podcast. This is already a really long podcast, an hour and 10 minutes. My first podcast, so I kind of ramble a little bit. Maybe later on I'll get better at keeping myself on track. I don't want to completely write it out because I want these to be long, and I want them to be kind of off the cuff a little bit. Yeah. So, hope you enjoyed that. I think all this stuff is very interesting. And for some reason, for whatever reason, playing Minecraft really gets me thinking about these things. Now, I thought about these things long before playing Minecraft. I thought about these things about a year ago. But it's when playing Minecraft that I really start... I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is about Minecraft that makes me really think about this stuff, about the kind of mind that people in, say, 3000 BC had. You know, what led them to create religion de novo. And it's not an inertia thing anymore. Like, what caused them to create states de novo? You know, today it's like people are just scared, they don't want change. But and it's also more simple too. Like they don't have, you know, central banks. They didn't have all these complicated things going on. They didn't have mass culture. They didn't have comedy shows and all this stuff. It was very very romantic. Very I really am very interested in the past, and in the past where we can see things that exist today being proposed and put forward in archetypal forms, right? And even like political movements being put forth in archetypal forms. Like, for example, Marxism, like the purity of Marxism and the purity of the early socialist anarchists, right? Before being muddled up in the modern mishmash of politics and politicking and propagandizing and just stupid people voicing their own opinions, fucking these things up. I mean, that's pretty bad. And that's another podcast I'm going to do is the democratic man thinking that he has a right to his opinion and all this shit. But I'll end there.